Our brains actually encode information as fuzzy traces, more like a general meaning than an exact record. And adults are more likely to combine those traces into false memories. You saw Mom put the dog in the office on a number of occasions.
My God, what did they do to you?
Way before Dad forbade anyone else from going in the office. Those traces fused with your memory of that day.
I feel sorry for you.
Okay, what's more likely? That you're misremembering events from 11 years ago? Or that the mirror eats dogs?
That the only thing we have to fear is itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Fear of God. We hope very sincerely that you're enjoying this show because we really enjoy making it for you. We are at episode 87, which is very difficult to believe. We're ramping up for episode 100. We here at The Fear of God, we have conversations every week about the intersection between faith and horror and occasionally superheroes. And my name is Reed Lackey. But typically with me is one Mr. Nathan Rouse, but he said something about this mad supervillain who is taking over the city and it like had, you know, these tentacles for arms and so he had to go and he had to fight them and I was like, man, you know what this sounds like? It sounds like a Spider-Man story. And he was like, well, yeah, Dr. Oculus, you know, like I have to go and I have to rid the city of Dr. Nathan, hi, how's it going, buddy? It's good to see you.
Boo.
How you doing? What are you doing? How did it go
Wow.
with your fight with Dr. Oculus?
Otto Oculavius.
Otto Oculavius.
I don't know. That was something. You were working for that. I mean, I'm impressed. I think.
You're either impressed or embarrassed or a little bit of both.
I think
that's a feeling very common.
We've had a good run, Reed. We've had a good run. It's time to close up shop.
Like when those puns start making their way in, then yeah, we absolutely have to close up shop.
But no, I'm doing well. Just fresh from my fight with one of my Sinister Six. And
good old Dr. Oculus.
Let's talk about Infinity War some more. That was a good movie.
Oh, that was such a good movie. That was so great.
What's your favorite scene? If you had to pick a favorite scene, what would be your favorite scene from Infinity War?
Oh my gosh. Off the top of my head, I think my favorite scene for just pure enjoyment is the Wakanda battle once Thor shows up. That was just an incredible
There's so
scene.
many of them.
But there are so many. I mean, there's just some outstanding scenes. I tell you what there's a mountain of is favorite lines.
Mm-hmm.
Favorite lines like, you know, you're embarrassing me in front of the wizard.
Peter Quill, you're a dude. This is a man. Gosh, that was funny.
I am invisible.
Oh,
you cannot see.
That was so random.
Oh my gosh, it's so great. Yeah, that's such a wonderful movie.
I loved my favorite line in the movie is when Steve Rogers shows up and my kid was like, Daddy, you look just like him. And I was kid, give me a shield.
That's awesome. Oh,
Get
that's
this
awesome.
man a shield. No, I mean,
so
it was so much. It was so much awesome.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
that's
kind of in the spirit of that, Mr. Nathan Rouse.
Yeah.
I just want to know what you watching. What you reading. What you listening to.
Number two.
Wow. don't even know where I was trying. It's like I was trying to go for some deep soul singer and wound up like a horse. I don't know what happened.
I don't know.
Awful. Yeah, it was awful.
I'd rather talk about Infinity War than what I really have, but I'll tell you what I really have. So, well, because it's a downer. My wife and I are I think by the time this airs, it will be at about 4 or 5. But my wife and I are 2 episodes into Handmaid's Tale 2, season 2.
So here's what's funny.
Yeah.
And, hold your thought. Because
are you about to talk about this?
No. The moment you said this is a downer, the very first place my mind went was Handmaid's Tale. That's the very first place my mind went.
Yeah, you know me so well.
I do.
Well, and I'll preface it by saying we love the show Blackish, and I've referenced that on the show on the podcast before. Well, Blackish is like a really great palate cleanser to your day, as a good sitcom can tend to be, and Blackish for its subject matter can tend to be a bit charged as well. Well, so we watched this really heavy episode of Handmaid's Tale season 2, and then we tried to cleanse our palate with Blackish, and at least again where we're at currently, the current arc in Blackish is like embattling the 2 currently at least married leads against each other, and it's really heavy and kind of sad, and you're like,
man.
oh God, that didn't cleanse the palate at all. Oh yeah. Anyway, so Handmaid's Tale 2. I watched the entirety of 1. I have not read the book. I watched the entirety of 1 and found it pretty riveting, pretty fascinating, as good sci-fi can be, sort of quite distant enough, but still a little closer to reality than I'd like in certain ways, and at least thematically. So I was kind of anxious to get back to the story.
Sure.
And I don't know, man. We watched the first one, and it's got a really harrowing opening 10 minutes. And kind of like, we talk about horror movies in general, so this will make sense to you. You know that feeling where something can be harrowing, but it's making you feel things, so you're kind of okay with it in terms of media?
Of course. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
So that's a lot of what the substance of Handmaid's Tale has been. It's like, this is kind of challenging. It's hard. Some of it's really riveting, but it is making me feel things and making me think about things. Sometimes it's very sad and heavy, but sometimes it's kind of cheering too. And Ann Dowd is on it, and I adore Ann Dowd as an actor, and so I will praise it for that. But I think something happened in my spirit watching the second episode where something about the first season, knowing it was kind of a closed story based on pre-existing material, I don't know that I intellectually engaged with it on where I'm going to go here. There was a way I could engage season 1 for a bit of its impermanence, if that makes any sense from a storytelling standpoint. The second episode of season 2 makes a narrative choice that I don't think I would have recognized I would be unready for, and that's what happens when the world is normalized. And from a production standpoint, what if Handmaid's Tale continues for 5 or 6 seasons, and this moment occurred for me as a viewer where I was like, I'll be straight up. I kind of ended the episode heartbroken and just thinking like, I don't know that I want to do this to myself. It was like just...
Yeah, okay.
It was just hard enough and just real enough. And the reality of, what if this show continues for 3, 4, 5 seasons? Do I want to keep pushing myself into these feelings? And I don't know. So...
Okay.
I may choose to sucker punch myself another time or two just to see how some of it plays out, but it's just
where things go.
It's just so heavy. It is so heavy. And I love Leftovers, and brother, that Shinto is heavy.
Leftovers is very heavy.
But
I was
going to say I know Lindelof's sensibilities enough, and I trusted that the story of Leftovers, though heavy, had a hopeful sheen on it. And so I was willing to endure the heavy because I kind of trusted the storyteller. Which isn't to suggest that I, to use my language, don't trust the Handmaid's Tale storyteller. I don't know who it is. I haven't looked enough at the showrunner. You know what I mean? I don't know. I don't have that sort of connection to the creator to be able to dig in there. Anyway, that's That's what I'm watching.
Wow, yeah. What Eeyore's watching this week? I can understand what you're saying though. Is that there's times where you're engaging with material and it has to push a certain degree of buttons. I liken really heavy material to the visual of going deeper into the ocean in some sort of sea vessel like a submarine. You can only go down so much to where the pressure kind of gets to you.
Right.
And you have to have something to offset that. Now, that something can be, a thought-provoking element. That something can be humor sometimes,
right.
If it's flirted in. Like you talked about, a hopeful sheen or a provocative outlook to things. It could be any number of things. But if it is purely just dour and heavy, I'm with you. I struggle sometimes with getting into those kinds of stories that are just not, and I haven't seen Handmaid's Tale yet, not even one episode, so I don't know if this would apply, but when something is just purely very thick with sort of dour and down sentiments, I struggle with that.
That's a pretty good analogy, Lucky. I like your submersible imagery. It helps me. I need to get out of my cyclical disdain from the submersible I'm in. And I need occasional humor or levity. I need, as you said, a provocative outlook. I need something to pierce the darkness. Like a good Frank Peretti novel. Just need something like that to lift my spirits when I'm in the dumps. But no, in all seriousness, no, I think you're right. And that's why I say I did like a lot about season 1, and I'm hesitant with one episode to jump out. But knowing my state of heart in a current season I'm in, and it's like, oh my God, just somebody,
sure, yeah,
that image of the submarine going deeper under the water and the pressure mounting, and you're like, I need a break. I need someone to crack a joke or a smile.
Can we take 5, please?
Can someone on this show just fart, please? Can someone fart? I just need something to laugh about.
Oh my gosh, that's hysterical. So what I'm watching is much more hopeful and optimistic, although with with an equally heavy entrance point. So, my friend, because you had the opportunity, though I am very jealous of this, to meet him, but selfless man though you are, when you met him, you got a book signed for me because you knew my affection for him. I am a very, very big fan, have been for many years, of Michael Card, CCM singer, and it feels almost a little reductive to call him like a CCM singer because he really is kind of his own thing. He's a very sort of classical artist. There is a commonality to a lot of his music. Sometimes he gets a little dismissed because there is a similar rhythm to a lot of the material that he produces, but he's very deeply entrenched in theological thoughts and scriptural studies, and he released a book. It's almost 10 years ago now at this point, but I'm only just stumbling upon it and reading it, called A Better Freedom. Have you heard of this book?
No.
The premise is really impressive, and to be honest, I was a bit nervous to dive into it, but because it's Michael Card, I trust him, and so I was like, let me go ahead. It is the premise of the book is this: he, as part of a movement with a church that he was connected to, was trying to do some interracial healing, some relational healing in some local communities where they had various minorities sort of all coming to the table together, to worship together, to discuss things together, to discuss issues. And he said that when he was sitting in this predominantly African-American church, he was struck by how many times in that particular service they referred to Jesus as master, which is very specifically slavery language.
Right.
And so he inquired of the pastor that dynamic and sort of digging into it. And one of the things that the pastor had said to him, specifically sort of in the context of the history of American slavery, that many African Americans would frequently refer to Jesus as master as a reminder outwardly and inwardly that their earthly masters were not the master. And so Card uses this conversation as a springboard to launch into the language of slavery in the Bible. specifically that how many times Paul called himself a slave to Christ, that Christ himself took on sort of the lowliness of a slave, as it were. Many times the word that we translate as servant would in fact read to contemporary audiences of the scriptures as a slave, that would be the language that is used. And so he digs deep into, and it is a brief book, but he digs into this notion of like, okay, we need to understand what the word slave meant to the Hebrew people in the days of Abraham and Moses and coming out of their slavery in Egypt. We need to understand what it meant to them. We need to understand what it meant to the contemporaries of Christ, the Roman sort of idea of slavery. And then he had this one passage that I thought was really fascinating, because he said, when we see the word slave in the Bible, you are dealing with three worlds colliding into one word, because you have predominantly the scriptures were written by Hebrews, so you have the Hebrew understanding of the word slavery. They were written, for many of them, in the time of the Roman Empire, so you have the contemporaries that were reading it and their understanding of the word slavery. But several centuries later, you're also reading it through the context of a very specific American understanding of African American slavery. And so what does all of that mean, and what does it translate to the calling that Paul and Peter and James and Jude felt for being slaves to Christ? And dare I say, as with all of Michael Card's material, it is rich and it is inspiring, and it is really very powerful. He talks, I'll say this one last pitch for the book, and then I'll just recommend that as many people as possible go read it. He says it one thing, because and we've said this, a similar thing on the show before, how the kingdom of God is upside down thinking. That the kingdom of God, you have to, basically lose your life to find it. In the kingdom of God, the truly rich are those who are poor in spirit. In the kingdom of God, real maturity comes from connecting with your childlikeness. In the kingdom of God, as he puts it as well, finding the ultimate freedom comes in being basically a slave to Christ. And he talks about how the world will seduce you into slavery and call it freedom. Meanwhile, Christ invites us to take up our cross and follow him, inviting us into a freedom that we could not possibly imagine. So it's a really, it's a thoughtful and sensitive book, and I just, I'm really being encouraged by it, and I'm really also being prompted to look at, because it's often been debated about, the scripture's handling of slavery. He directly addresses that in the book. It is a really encouraging and thoughtful and wonderful little book, and it's very brief. I would recommend it. It's called A Better Freedom by Michael Card. So that's what I've been reading. So this is a bit of a heavier installment, it feels like, of the good old
Slavery, Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah. So
let's
a bit
dive into this happy-go-lucky movie we're talking about today.
So we are continuing our. We'll go ahead and forego the song because it's dour.
Because we're all sad now.
Yeah, we're all sad. But we'll try to pick it up here, diving into Dr. Oculus, because basically. So basically, we're continuing our series on hashtag Consider the Blooms, and so the next one that we wanted to cover is a film by Mike Flanagan, director Mike Flanagan, who has rapidly become one of my favorite sort of go-to, get excited about their new project directors.
What else has he done?
So he's done. One of the early things that I saw from him was this film called Absentia.
I remember you mentioning that.
And I was impressed with it. I mean, it's low budget and it's not perfect, but it's impressive for what little he clearly had to work with. And then I also saw his film Hush on Netflix, which maybe we will cover. We'll see, because it is a Blumhouse production as well. But then also I was looking kind of at his filmography, and I'm like, man, he has made a lot of films that I just really enjoy quite a bit. He's made Hush for Netflix, Absentia. I also really enjoy Ouija Origin of Evil, which I think is a really strong film. He also made the adaptation of Gerald's Game, the Stephen King film, again, direct for Netflix. He's kind of gotten in bed with Netflix because he's like, all of his material is there, and he's, I say all of his material. A good chunk of his material is available to stream on Netflix. He is also actively developing right now, maybe even filming, scheduled, I think, for Halloween release, a 10-episode series for Netflix adapting Shirley Jackson's novel, The Haunting of Hill House. Call out to, a couple of episodes ago with The Lottery. So he's doing that. He's also doing the Stephen King sequel to The Shining, Dr. Sleep.
Really?
So,
Is that meant
yeah.
do you know if that's meant to be a theatrical release?
That is, from my understanding, a theatrical release. But yeah, he's just quickly become a director that I've really been impressed with. I've really enjoyed his material pretty consistently. I like his sensibilities. I also enjoyed his film, again, Netflix exclusive, Before I Wake. So yeah, he's got some really good material out there, and I really like him, and I really like this film. Had you ever heard of any of those works that I've mentioned, or acquainted with Mike Flanagan's work at all prior to Oculus?
Dr. Oculus.
Dr. Oculus.
I mean, I've seen the names of the films you're referring to on various lists and or on Netflix itself over the last year and a half or so, but I really didn't know much about any of them and would not have connected them all to one director.
Sure.
In fact, I don't know if you recall, in trying to discern what we were going to discuss for this particular episode, you had put several options to me. And honestly, I think all I did to make my decision, because you had said, I think you had advised, go watch trailers or read a synopsis or something to make my choice.
Right.
And I really didn't want to go that deep. I just kind of wanted a bare kind of glimpse. And so I saw for Oculus something about Haunted Mirror. And I was like, okay, that's weird. Let's do that. Like,
oh, interesting. Okay. All right. Sure.
Like it's outside the, we cover a lot of like serial killer type stuff and things like that. Like something about a haunted mirror.
It's a very different premise.
Yeah.
I like it quite a bit. Yeah. So how did you enjoy the film in general?
Here's however long this movie is. Let's say it's an hour and a half. The first 45 minutes or so, I was like, okay, it's okay. I mean, feels a little low budget, but that's okay. It's a little slow, but that's okay. And then
you kind of patting the movie on the back for the first 45 minutes, like they're there.
The last 45 minutes was me to myself saying, "You're okay. You're okay. You're gonna be okay."
Oh my God!
I will say this, and I'm tipping my hand a little bit. Like, it won't be unless you just make an extremely compelling case. It won't be like an all fives pumpkins for me, but by the end of it, I was very under its spell. Like,
sure.
I mean, I mean, in all transparency, those first 15, 20, 25 minutes, it really was just kind of okay. I was like, well, all right. I mean, this is, I don't think Tim, I think ultimately he's pretty good. Tim, the actor, just visually, he's a very pretty boy kind of actor. And I was like, I can't tell what I think of these performers and the kind of lo-fi feel it has. And, Karen Gillan playing a 23-year-old just really struck me as funny. I was like, okay, that's a stretch, but whatever. So, that first kind of half hour or so, I wasn't sure if I was totally in on, but then it really starts, the roller coaster starts, it hits its peak, and then its descent, its maddening descent starts happening. I'll tell this funny story. So last week I told about my worst birthday ever. It is not often that I have this kind of response to the movies we watch. So my wife came home. She was out with a friend or something, and so I'm watching it while the kids are in bed, and I'm by myself. She comes home at like 10 minutes left in the movie, and like those last 15, 20 minutes really do a number on you. I mean, it really ratchets up into kind of Terror Town, and we should trademark that, Terror Town. Yeah, that's
Terror Town.
Should look into that. That's the Fear of God conference next year. Come to Terror Town.
Terror Town.
So she gets home. There's like 10 minutes left in the movie. The movie finishes. I'm in our den. There's no lights on but the TV. She's down the hall. I was like, wife, because you don't want to yell because your kids are asleep.
Yeah, of course.
She was like, what? I was like, come here. So she comes down the hall. I take her hand and then I turn off the TV, and then together we walk down the hall. Because hell, if I was turning off the TV into the dark and walking down that hall by myself.
That is hysterical.
So then it gets better. Then, like, even she's like, really? Like, yes, shut up and just walk me down the hall. And so then we get into the bedroom and, you know, taking out contacts, brushing teeth, all that sort of stuff. I get in bed and we have this full-length mirror. And never has it done anything to me. And I lay in bed, and across the room is this stupid mirror. I was like, yeah, that's got to get turned around. And she's like, are you for real? Yes, I'm for real. That is definitely not going to possess me in the night. Turn it around. So she does that. I mean, I'm in bed, and then I noticed that our closet is open. I was like, close the closet, please. There's going to be no Oculus looking at me in the night, you know, like close all the doors. I don't care if the kids get taken. I am not getting taken, you know?
Wow. Lock the door. Lock the door. They're on their own.
Turn the mirror around. So yes, that was the 30 minutes after Oculus ended was my experience of that.
Well, I sympathize. It didn't quite do that number on me, but I think it's funny. Like, I would say a similar sort of rhythm to what you've described of this whole, like, sort of ramping up in the first half hour, 40 minutes or so, maybe establishing character, establishing premise, establishing things like that. With the exception, I would point to with the exception of Hush and maybe Ouija Origin of Evil, but no, I think Origin of Evil is kind of a similar way. That it's like, that's kind of Mike Flanagan's rhythm. That's what he basically does, is he's just like, he lures you in with 30 to 45 minutes of like, yeah, I mean, maybe some creepy stuff is happening, but whatever, and then delivers, from, in my opinion, some real powerhouse finales, just some real nerve-wracking, knuckle-biting kind of tension, which is one of the things I really love about that, is I feel like he takes his time, and I feel like he lets the stories breathe, and he lets you get to know the characters, and that's something that I really appreciate about this film and about his work in general. Yeah, this was my second viewing of it, and even though I knew what was coming, and even though I knew what I was about to see, it's still, I kind of felt, it wasn't to the extreme that you had, but I definitely like left the lights on while I watched the film. I was like, yeah, no, I'll get to those dishes eventually. I just leave the light on until after I finish the dishes, you know. I'll let
the mirror monster take care of those.
but yeah, I mean, I think it's a rich, a really effective horror film. I also love just the notion of, I feel like mirrors in general get used to effect for jump scares, but you mentioned earlier that was part of what was kind of drawing you into choosing this film.
Yeah.
I do feel like sort of the haunted mirror phenomenon, there's a lot of ripe opportunity to do some scary stuff with it, but I don't feel like it's usually baked into the premise of most stories. There are 2 or 3 where, you know, there's a mirror at the center of the story, but most of the time it's just used for 1 or 2 jump scares throughout the narrative. But here you have actually this really, you know, fleshed out kind of notion of like, yeah, this is a haunted artifact. You could almost expect the Warrens to show up at one point and try to smash the mirror.
Yeah.
You know, that it's like in sort of that Conjuring kind of ideal, but unfortunately without Ed and Lorraine Warren to expel the monster or whatever it is from the mirror.
Well, and I think it drew me in immediately, though I'm with you and with myself of 10 minutes ago saying, you know, it shifts down a gear in terms of intensity for those first 30 minutes, but that opening scene with the kids in the closet.
Oh man!
When that scene, when that's the beginning, I was like, oh, I don't know, you know, like because you don't know context or anything like that. It's just a little distressing.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of pure just likes dislikes, it was kind of nice to see Katie Sackhoff in a role. I feel like she really had a moment with Battlestar, and then just hasn't done a whole. I mean, to my knowledge, hasn't done a ton. I know she did a spot on 24 for a season, but this is really the only other thing can recall seeing her in. And I wouldn't put her in what I've seen of her in, you know, top A-list kind of talent per se, but I do think she's a very competent performer and is pretty charismatic in what she does. So
absolutely.
Kind of fun to see her in this.
Agree. Yeah, I certainly agree. And I think all of the performers in this are strong. Karen Gillan, again, shout out Infinity War is old Nebula. And so like I think all of the performers, like you said, the actor who plays Tim, which I'm going to look up so that I do not foible this, Brenton Thwaites, he is definitely like you said, a pretty boy type, but I think delivers a pretty competent performance. I think he's very strong, and that, particularly
I'll own that was me being judgmental.
Yeah. But it is really fascinating. I keep wanting to, listeners may hear me stumbling over my words. I keep actively wanting to not jump into theme. Because I think there's something inherent in the theme of this film, in the conceit of this film, rather, that I find thematically very compelling and thematically very resonant. I think just in general, the whole elaborate setup, I love when she's first expressing to him all these efforts she's gone to. She got this dog, the plants, setting up the cameras a certain way, the safety anchor, all of that sort of stuff. At first you're like, what in the world is all of this? But actually really get invigorated in that moment when she's telling the camera about all of the different people who have owned the mirror. Things start really ramping up. I'm like, oh dang, like this is really pretty cool. But then when things start going strange for them, here's what I love about it. I think a lesser film and a lesser filmmaker would have tipped their hand when things are going weird much sooner than Oculus does. Because I'll point to one specific moment when she's changing a light bulb, and and then the apple next to the light bulb thing. It's like something like that. It is set up so just casually. It's, the creepiness is like, oh, the light went out, like there's not much to that, but she grabs it when she crunches into the apple and you hear the glass break. But even more so than that, going the step further, that she has to, you think she's just bit into this light bulb, but then when he shows up and she really has bit into the apple. It's like, oh my gosh, this is... Yeah,
once it starts playing around with what they are perceiving is when it really starts kicking up a notch. I mean,
their reality.
And I'll save, because part of my affection for that conceit tips over into theme a little bit. But do you want to browse down the scare hall for a minute before we?
Yeah. Let's do that.
I mean, you just bit into one of the worst ones. Oh my gosh, when that happens.
That is a horrifying moment.
And listener, if you haven't seen the movie or aren't going to, I mean, it is pretty scary, but, the character's perception of their own reality starts getting messed with. But one thing that's impressive about the movie is, unlike a lot of movies like it, or we might say a lesser effort, you as the viewer aren't tipped off by any sort of production means. There's no like lighting change. There's no sort of color palette difference. It is literally just the character you're watching suddenly is engaging in something very odd. You don't really understand what's happening, and they don't even know what's happening to them. So in this particular scene, she's eating an apple. She unplugs a light bulb, sets it next to the apple, replugs a new one, picks up what she thinks is the apple. The camera is on her back. She bites in. It's crunching, and it's glass in her mouth. It's disgusting.
Oh my gosh! It's
but I mean, there were several. I will say, like, having not seen the movie, it was effective. The early scene when the mirror is in the antiques kind of closet, if you will, and the three busts.
Yes. Oh wow.
That's effective.
With the drapes over them.
That's effective.
Oh yes.
Because why that's effective to me is we haven't been introduced to any of the rules yet. So you're kind of like, was that a production error? Was that a continuity error? That there were three of them, now there's two, now there's what's going on? Oh God, there is three, there's not three. Yeah, this is real great moment.
Oh man. Oh yes.
So that's really good. I mean, dude, I feel like there was another movie. Oh, The Fly. Dear Lord. Any movie involving the removal, accidental or otherwise, of a fingernail is just going to ratchet up the tension, much less with a staple puller. That is,
oh my gosh,
vile.
Well, I was sitting there thinking, I was like, who removes a Band-Aid with a staple puller? Like, what in the world? But that's what's so twisted about this film, is this notion of when it starts really ratcheting up, where I start to get really scared is, are they seeing what we think they're seeing, or is it a trick? Like the notion, I love the notion where they walk in after having this full conversation out in the hallway. They walk in and the cameras are together and the plants are dead and everything's done. But then when they look back at the camera, they were having the they look back at the footage. They were having the conversation that they thought they were having out in the hall while they were physically moving all of it. And what the film never tells you is which version of that reality is the trick. Is the trick that they were doing it all and the mirror made them think they were out in the hall, or were they doing it out in the hall and the mirror made them think that they moved it? So it's really playing with that whole thing the entire time.
I feel like we've been slightly remiss here. If you haven't watched this movie, it is a pretty good movie, though it is pretty scary. It's got a few elements of gore to it, but nothing major. It really is just more kind of just a scary movie. But the general premise is two kids under their two parents. The father deals in some antiques, owns a business, comes on this mirror. The mirror has these terrible effects on the parents. They end up, the wife goes crazy, or the mom goes crazy. The dad is kind of under its sway as well. Ultimately, the son at 11 years old is compelled by the father to kill the father. So the son kills the father at 11. And so it's these parallel stories of you as the viewer learning what happened 10 years ago and watching how these characters, now that they've come together, because the son gets sent to basically like a mental hospital.
Right.
And he's been released. The sister has found the mirror. They take the mirror back to their house to try to destroy the mirror. Now that I'm thinking about it. Okay, yeah. Her plan is to sort of prove her suspicions about what this thing really is and to ultimately destroy it. But the movie kind of establishes that this mirror has an area of effect in which its weirdness takes hold, and that area of effect continues to grow throughout the house as the movie progresses.
Yes.
Until you as the viewer aren't sure what you're seeing. And we can flirt with some more or explicitly discuss some more scares, but where the movie went from, first 30 minutes, it's decent. Second 30 minutes, okay, this is good. This is scary. It doesn't feel gratuitously so, but it is legitimately scary and is establishing some really good tension. Reed, for me, when it clicked over into, man, there is something deeper happening here, is when the child of 10 years ago passes in frame the adult of the present. When the memory starts overlapping.
Yes.
It just had this, you could, and this is kind of a weird thing to say, it's like the TV was having the mirror effect on me. I was like, this is fascinating, and has now become a much more interesting, it was already a good, scary story. Now it's become a real, like, okay, I feel like there's something deeper happening here kind of story.
Yes,
I love that moment. It's when I think they're on the stairs or they pass in the hallway. It's the boy passing Karen Gillan.
Right. Yeah.
But from there on, there's a number of those intersections that happen between.
Absolutely. Yes.
As opposed to purely you're watching 10 years ago, you're watching present. Those two things start to merge.
And one of the things I love about it is that the film gives you an indication, especially in her diatribe in the, kind of the first third mark, an indication of some of the rules, but it doesn't explain a lot. So what you are left with is impressions of moments like that where you have to kind of pick up some of the puzzle pieces. And I that's true of more than just this in Flanagan's work, but I really love that about it. I love that it gives you enough that you can follow what's happening and you can kind of understand the threat, but without getting deeply into the minutia of what this mirror can and cannot do. Is it, like I mentioned, it doesn't tell you which one of those versions is the trick. So is she breaking through into the younger, or is she, where is the line getting getting crossed. Where's
Right,
the reality
right.
blurring into itself? And I find that rich and fascinating. And one of the things that really just creeped the crap out of me is when the dad says to the younger kids, like, mom's sick, she's going to need, some alone time or need some privacy or whatever. Like, you guys don't go up there, and it's a while before they do. It's a little bit of time before they finally go up there, but when they finally do and you find out what state mom is in, oh man. And yeah, listeners, if you've seen the film, you know what state mom is in. If you haven't, I'm not going to describe it for you, but just, she's not doing well. And it is terrifying and like stomach churning, and it's, oh man. Yeah. It's just not only scary, but also upsetting.
Yes.
That
yes.
the things that you're seeing are upsetting because this family seems to really love each other.
Right.
Like they seem to
Right.
really root
Right.
for each other and everything. So to see the effect of this mirror come in and unravel so much of that it's not only frightening, it is also distressing, as it were.
Yeah, I agree totally with you. I think, I've got a couple more scares, but they'll come up incidentally, I suppose. But I think, are you okay if we sort of
Let's go. Yeah, let's follow it. Yeah.
One thing I did want to say is, you alluded to this indirectly, but reading the Wikipedia page on it, Flanagan's interest of not telling the minutia as you describe it, it was intended to be more Lovecraftian. This sort of like, it is just pure evil personified. It invokes madness. You know what I mean? It's like we don't need to know every little jot and tittle, as it were, to know how it works. We just need to understand certain basics, and then kind of roll with the rest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although I will say, even though I just suggested otherwise, I will say the moment, I'll keep calling her Nebula, when she has gone into the trance, standing in front of the mirror.
Oh my gosh.
And then the swinging anchor bell starts to ring. And as a viewer, you're like, oh God, move, girl, move. Oh, what?
Yes,
Oh God.
yes.
It's got you. And well, and I guess I didn't quite finish the synopsis, but this is definitely spoiler here. So the 10 years ago son is, through the father's influence and sort of his own actions, shoots the father and kills him. In the present day, the mirror is playing tricks on both of them and on you, the viewer. The climax is he thinks he's aggressively attacking the mirror, finally is going to break its spell and break it, and flips the switch to bring the swinging blade anchor thing down that would ostensibly destroy it. But his perception is being played with, doesn't realize she is standing in front of the mirror, so he kills his sister.
Oh my gosh.
At the end of it. And it's just this terrible, heartrending sort of thing.
Well, and the part that really breaks my heart about that is the final shot of the film, because the final shot of the film is him as the grown version of himself getting carted away in the police car for having killed her, while the young version of her watches the similar scenario of him getting taken away
after killing the
child.
Dad. Right.
Yeah. And so it's very gut wrenching that this mirror has kind of claimed almost their entire family,
right,
and by extension claimed him, even though he's still alive. Yeah, it's a bleak film. It's a rather bleak film. But go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off.
No. I've got two general thematic ideas, and I don't know how much talking I'll do related to them other than just to share them. But I think something that really arrested me, and it began with that opening sequence of children, a daughter with blood smeared on her face, running together through a home and trying to escape what you learn is their own father. And so that's a notch on the thematic belt. Well, then the deeper it gets into it, I think my heart just really broke for that family in a way it doesn't often do in some of these movies. And so kudos to Flanagan for being able to pull that off. Like, well, what I wrote down is how kids perceive their world. slash mindfulness as a parent. And I think it's just been a while, or maybe I just haven't seen enough media with this in it as an element. I don't know, but scenes of the kids interacting with the father or perceiving things about the parents as the parents are being taken by the mirror, you could say as a literal evils infested the home, but also as a metaphorical or a figurative, like the relationship of parents and children. I think I was just really kind of noticing and thinking about the things our children themselves notice and think about and pay attention to and overhear.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I know the movie ultimately isn't quite, well, maybe I was going to say the movie's not really about that, though maybe in part it is.
Oh, that's definitely an element. Oh, that's absolutely an element. This notion of, because keep in mind that part of her primary mission is to exonerate both her father and him at the same time. Like that's what she's seeking out to do, is that they were, it definitely is playing with the notions of how we perceive our parents and how we perceive what happens to our parents versus what the quote unquote reality is. Yeah, I think that's definitely an element of the film.
I think I was just, I don't know, kind of struck. Last week we talked about paying attention and getting stuck in ruts and how ruts can cause us to sort of miss the forest for the trees, as it were. And I think a movie like this, or at least a theme in a movie like this, you know, it doesn't make you want to go hug your kids in the middle of the night because you're scared for their lives, as much as it just makes you want to be mindful of how you are towards them and around them, and the language you use and the burdens you carry in front of them, or I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, it does. It does. And kind of softly piggybacking off of that to one of my sort of primary observations. So the premise is a haunted mirror, and a mirror is intended to show you kind of how things are, what things really look like. It's intended, you look in a mirror, you're supposed to be able to see a close version of reality. This is what my face looks like. This is what my hair looks like. This is what's here. The mirror will reflect the images behind you. But what's interesting to me about this premise is that this is a mirror that, as we've already said, is actually playing with and distorting reality. Mm-hmm. So this is a device that is intended at its base level to reflect an accurate picture of reality, but instead is presenting a distortion of reality. And in relationship to this notion of our parents and ourselves, I think, and we've talked about this on the show numerous times now at this point, about how sometimes we will look at a thing, because what's interesting, I can't remember where I saw this and I don't have it in front of me, but like Oculus does not only mean like an ovular window or a circular sort of window, but it can also refer to the opening of your eye,
right.
The way you see you see things. And so one of the things that I find interesting about the premise of the film, and in this relationship of ways we perceive our parents and the ways we as parents perceive our kids, and that interplay there, is we talk a lot about how someone will express a thing as reality, but we will acknowledge that that is really just a very specific perspective. And we have that too. Like we come to the horror genre with a Christian perspective, but not even just that. The moment you say Christian perspective, there's also, what variety of Christianity are you espousing? And where are the nuances and where are the intricacies of your particular, framework? There's some commonality, but then there's also some uniqueness. And so I just found it very interesting in the premise, in the notion. I think a lot of us, as we are, I as a parent, and I know you would too, you would say that when we're trying to teach our children and equip our children for how to navigate the world, we really are consistently balancing what we would deem reality and what we would deem perspective. And we're constantly shifting that.
Sure.
My son has a tendency to say this about some of the things that his friends at school will say. He'll say like, "Oh, well, no, she wasn't lying about that. She wasn't mistaken." And it'll be something. I'm chuckling a little bit because it'll be something like, "No, they like those toys really do come alive at night. Like, that really does have that. That's not a specific example, but it's the nature of the kind of thing that he'll say. It's like something that is immediately recognizable as fanciful and fantastical. And he's saying like, no, they're not lying about that." And it's interesting because as a parent and you're trying to navigate him through that, one of the things that I've dug my heels in on a little bit is this notion of trust. And, I've told him, like, I want you to trust your friends, but at the age you're at, you need to trust mommy and daddy more. I do want you to be trustful of, your teacher or whatever, but if mommy and daddy tell you something, like, you need to trust us more. And that's, maybe a bit heavy of language to use for a 6-year-old, but it's something that I'm already trying to infuse in this notion of like, yeah, you can believe them, but when what they're saying comes into conflict with what we're saying, we need you to trust us.
Sure,
we need you to go the direction that we're leading. And it is funny how I think all of us are constantly maybe at war within ourselves with trusting and combating what our parents have given us. And also at the same time, those of us who are parents, like constantly trying to infuse trust and at the same time wanting them to be healthy and open-minded thinkers on their own end. It's a tough tightrope to walk, Well,
really and almost more than that, it's like, this is not to dispense with the very real responsibility we have as caretakers of our children for the roughly 18 or so years in which they are most immediately in our care. But even with what you were saying, still acknowledging ours is but one perspective as well, and and while our intention is to encourage and to protect and to safeguard and to challenge, on and on it goes, our children, we still are operating with a cracked mirror, if you will,
Yes.
It's interesting. This may seem like a random aside, but I thought about it during watching reading and just didn't offer it there. And now, strangely, it's organically presented itself. I referenced a couple weeks ago, multiple times, I think at this point, the Bible for Normal People podcast. And they often have these very interesting guests. And one of the more recent episodes is a woman named Will Gaffney, I believe was her name. And African-American professor and minister woman. And she wrote a book called Womanist, I believe. And
I've heard of that.
Okay.
I haven't heard of her, but okay, so yeah. Womanist,
specifically, as a school of thought, is about specifically black women. So like, if you ever see that phrasing, it's referencing black women. And she has this really interesting, so the two guys who host that podcast are two white guys, and they're in academic theology themselves. And they had this really fascinating conversation that kind of plays into what you're talking about. They're not from a parenting perspective per se, as much as just from a theological one. And the three of them together kind of stumble into this notion that all of our theology has an adverb in front of it.
Oh, okay.
Whereas the two hosts, they're like, we would have been quick to say, well, the theology we prescribe to is just theology. Whereas
right.
yours is black female theology, or that person's is Native American theology. It may have a Christian sort of flavor to it, but it's rooted in these sort of perspectives. Whereas what they come to together is, well, no, yours is still a dominant culture, perhaps, but a white Anglo top of a culture's perspective theology.
Right.
And it's just this really fast, I would, even from a sociology standpoint, but definitely, for me personally, from a theology standpoint, I would encourage people to check it out. But it's this same idea. It's how, and dude, it is as fascinating as it can be troubling. The notion that you and I can read or consume or experience the exact same thing and come away with radically different perceptions of it.
Right.
I remember specifically, there was an episode of, and I won't go follow this too long, but I'm thinking of, there was an episode of Girls in its final season. There's this very specific on-camera device that they use in a scene. And it's at the very end of an episode. We finish it, and my wife is reflecting on one thing, and she had not caught this thing. And it's too hard to go into, but just know there was a thing that happened. She didn't register it in the moment. And I said, man, and did you catch the such and such? And she's like, what are you talking about? So sure enough, I rewound it and showed her, and she's like, oh my gosh, I didn't see that at all. But it's very present on screen. And anyway, just this notion how we all have our Oculus that we are seeing through. And
yes, absolutely.
And I think on the one hand, you want to live fully in your life and not subject everything to the scrutiny of, well, is this interpretation of this event or experience rooted in my express position and status and culture? Like, we don't want to necessarily subject everything to that level of scrutiny. And yet at the same time, we do have to be open to that sort of conversation, you know?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, and I think, too, one of the things that I find interesting, maybe taking this premise to a place that it doesn't substantiate, but I'm going to give it a shot, is one of the things that I find very interesting about this narrative is Kaylee she's correct about the supernatural malevolence of the mirror. She's correct. So all of the hard work that Tim did to sort of break free from his psychology of it, you know, and the context in which what had happened, that he flavors that, all of that work was kind of incorrect. But at the same notion, what again, I find this fascinating. What he is espousing to her in the early part of the film about leave it, let it go, you know, just be done with it. He is correct that is what they need to do if they want to survive, because they're not a match for the mirror.
Right.
So I just find it fascinating that he is approaching the correct direction from false information. She has the right information, but is pursuing a deadly end.
Well,
do you see what I mean?
I think I would nuance your wording there, that it's right or wrong. In the sense, I know what you're saying, and I'm splitting hairs for the purpose of conversation, but because I don't know that the treatment he undergoes is unhelpful to him.
Right.
You know what I mean?
No, I don't think
and I agree with you.
Yeah.
He has the correct conclusion. Like, we need to leave this thing alone. Why would you go pursue this?
Exactly.
You know, so I understand what you're saying. And it is kind of fascinating that he misperceives his history and treats it based on that. She properly perceives it and comes to a terrible conclusion, which is, no, let's screw this thing over because of how it screwed us over.
Right. And I think there's a way, and this is a broad statement, but I think this is true when you're dealing with perspective and you're dealing with trying to understand the world around you and the socio-political issues that arise. I think it is entirely possible to be wrong about your information, but to be espousing the correct mindset. And I think it is entirely possible to basically be pursuing the wrong ends with good factual information.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I think both of those things are possible. And I think when we are brave enough to understand kind of what we're talking about, that, hey, I have a certain subset of information in my hands, but I also have nobody on the planet, not you or I here, nobody else can fairly say that they are utterly objective about anything.
Sure.
Nobody can say that. I have made it a point in several candid conversations when I talk about my faith. I believe what I believe about Christianity because I believe that it is true. I don't need to shy away from that when I also say that is the information that I have.
Right.
So it's one of those things where it's like, yes, to a degree, I am making a choice about my faith. I am making a choice because I believe it to be true, but I am making an active choice to continue to pursue that end. And I think sometimes people can get so stuck into a particular, I'm talking about faith and Christianity, but I think sometimes with any mindset, whether it is a political mindset, a social mindset, a perception about, let me scale it back a little bit from the broad terms and talk about your perception of a rift or an occurrence in a friendship or in a relationship. Something occurs and it hurts your feelings or it upsets you. Well, you were just trying to do this thing. And you can dig your heels in about, I know exactly what you were doing. You were just spiting me, or you were just trying to undermine me, or you were doing all of these other sorts of things. And you dig your heels in on that motion when, from the other perspective or from another side of the same coin, it's one of the reasons I love the show Lost, because Lost like shows you these hidden pieces of information that you don't have about people in the common interactions that you're dealing with. So we, the viewer, get to see the histories that led to those conclusions and those decisions, where in the interactions of the characters, they're just going off of what they see.
Sure.
And I think it's imperative for us, if we're trying to navigate the world in a healthy manner and teach other people to do so, to constantly acknowledge these are the pieces of information that I have. This is the perspective from which I come to the conversation. And if you have both of those things in play, I think you're substantially better equipped to be able to reach a healthy, conclusive end than if you were to just say like, nope, I'm right, and everybody else needs to just shut up and step in line. I think what we have a tendency to do, and I'm going to kick against the opposite of that just a little bit, is I think we have a tendency to say in an almost relativistic mindset, is we have a tendency to treat truth or fact as fluid. So people will say like, oh, well, that's your truth versus my truth. They'll use that kind of language.
Sure.
Which I get very frustrated by that language, because what you're really talking about is perspective, not truth. What you're talking about is the specific makeup that makes you, which is no less valid, but it is different than objective reality. And it's different than what would necessarily be seen from a different perspective, looking at the exact same thing. I've constantly been challenged in my own thinking about certain issues, about certain incidents that happened. I encounter one thing, and at the moment I feel slighted and put upon, and I get upset because I feel like it was malicious or it was unfair, and then just seeing it from somebody else's perspective may completely flip the script on me and may suddenly be like, oh my gosh, it's like what the conversation we had with J.R. Forasteros about empathy and understanding that's like when you see things from a different perspective, you may still reach the same conclusion, or you may still, feel the same about the facts, but it's going to dramatically flavor how you navigate that situation. And final statement about Oculus for the moment is that is what is so powerful to me about this conceit, is this mirror is manipulating the way they see their present circumstances in both small and broad ways. It's manipulating it and confusing them and fostering confusion. The only safe thing for them to do is what Tim encouraged them to do in the beginning, which is get out of the sphere of influence.
Right.
Get away from that power, that force, leave it behind. But what Kaylee so badly wants to do is not control it. She doesn't want to control it. She wants to destroy it. And she's at least done enough research and taken enough initiative to understand the means by which she might be able to destroy it. But ultimately, she just doesn't have all the information. She just doesn't know the power of the force she's dealing with.
Well,
and yeah.
I mean, this may go nowhere, but it's a thought that is firing me up in the moment of like, in the film, the Oculus in question, the refracting agent, has an intentionally malign purpose.
Yes.
When and can an Oculus have a benevolent purpose? So where I'm going with this, something that struck me a few minutes ago as we were talking about, perspectives, competing perspectives, contrasting perspectives in a healthy society, competing perhaps in a less healthy one. I would argue we're in a pretty unhealthy one right now, but I reference them many times. EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative in Mobile, I believe it's in Mobile, just opened. And read like this has made bucket. This has made the bucket list. Like I don't know if have you seen any of the press on this place?
Yeah, I've seen some, and I've seen some footage of him giving a tour to, like, I think at one point he gave a tour to Oprah.
Yeah. Well, the EJI has just launched publicly funded. Like, this is not a government funded, subsidized enterprise. The National, I believe it's just called the Lynching Museum or National History of Lynching Museum, something like that. And dude, reading accounts of people's experience at this thing is powerful. And I think, and I remember a social media news outlet, like, let's say, I don't know, the New Yorker, Atlantic or something like that, had posted an article about it. So it wasn't EJI's feed, because EJI's feed would be populated by people who are sympathetic to EJI. But it was some news element that was posting about it, more informative than anything. And you read the comments, and dude, it is the venom of our day. It is like, well, why is this necessary? Upsetting. And, this is ridiculous, and blah, 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 and Confederacy and
just
history.
Stirring up trouble.
Yeah.
Just stirring up trouble. Yeah.
And at the same time, so you've got random Joe Schmoes out there who are getting their perspectives all bent out of shape and their perspective panties and wads because this Oculus in our culture is jacking with their reality. I don't know if you saw this. A Mobile newspaper. Mobile is like the heartbeat of what was and may still be, I don't know, I don't have the metrics for this, the racist South. The newspaper, the primary newspaper of Mobile last week, in conjunction with the opening of the National Lynching Museum, wrote an article that basically begins with, "We were wrong." Whoa. And goes and cites stories that their newspaper had published that wrongly objectified people of color who had been lynched in Mobile, wrongly incriminated them for the lynching they received, and stated the facts of the actual case that were later revealed.
Right.
So basically begins this article with "We were wrong," goes through a litany of stories of where their own newspaper screwed up, and ends with something to the effect of, "May we never be this wrong again."
Wow. And
I'm like, I don't know. I this is not in any of my notes, and so it's really just kind of off the cuff, but I'm thinking about an object, a totem in a culture. In the movie, it's this ancient evil mirror. What I'm referring to here is this cultural, historical landmark that is just totally jacking with our perspectives.
Yes. Yes.
And just how it's fascinating. It's kind of scary, Yes. Like, this should be a part of our sort of national reckoning kind of thing. But, there are folks who would not agree with me on that. Anyway, I know that seems like a random aside, but
no,
that idea of a singular item or singular sort of thing creating multiple competing perspectives and realities,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing that I we'll probably need to wind down, but I'll platform off of that. You've teased me before about bringing in the big guns of all conversations theologically and everything, but I'm going I'm going back to the Garden of Eden. And so I find this fascinating. I actually had a different scripture picked out, but this conversation is leading me in this way, so I'm just going to follow this trail. I pulled up while we were talking here. I pulled up Genesis chapter 3. And I'm looking at Genesis chapter 3, Eve is having a conversation with the serpent, and the serpent is basically sort of combating God's command to not eat the fruit. And then in verse 4 of chapter 3, the serpent said to the woman, "You will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And then verse 6 says, "When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. And then in verse 7, it says, she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. And verse 7 says, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. And it's just funny to me in this conversation, I had not put together how many times that passage of scripture talks about eye.
Sure.
Talks about seeing. And I have heard it postulated before. I cannot take credit for this theological observation, but I cannot recall in the moment where I heard this theological observation. That the notion is God tells them, don't eat the fruit because the day you eat the fruit, you're going to die. Then when they eat the fruit, what happens is that their eyes are opened. And what I have heard a theologian postulate before is it was in the opening of their eyes, or in the context of this conversation, the shifting of their perspective, that was the death God was referring to. Because they didn't keel over and fall dead. So you have to wrestle when you're looking at the text. It's like, okay, well, some people have said, well, they started the process of dying. It meant that sin was coming into the world. It's all kinds of things. It could mean all kinds of things. I'm not stating something definitive. I'm simply saying I heard a theologian postulate that the opening of their eyes was actually the death, this loss of innocence, if you want to get mythological about the whole thing, that entered into the world, as it were. And I just think it's fascinating when we're talking about this conversation and the ways that you perceive the world. There may be something, and we'll getting back to the negative reaction to a thing like the Equal Justice Initiative's National Lynching Museum, is there are perspectives that are attractive because they allow us to not deal with what we've done, but supposedly know good from evil. Like in the Garden of Eden, when their eyes are opened and they now know good and evil, but then when God comes and says, what happened here? And they're all like, that person's to blame. That person's to blame. That person's to blame. And it all just trickles right down the line. There is a notion and a perspective that is very attractive to us because of its absolving of us,
sure.
Because of the way that it lets us off the hook for the things for which we have been a party and the things that we have been responsible for, at least if we have not been directly responsible for it, that we have been at least a benefactor of its condition. Or there are ways in which we have inherited some of that curse or that blessing, depending on what subject we're talking about. And in terms of these reckonings, it's such a complex metaphor that you could attack it from different sides. But when we're talking about your eyes being clear and your eyes being healed, elsewhere the scriptures say that the eye is kind of the window into the spirit, the soul, and that if your eye is good, then the whole body is full of light. But if the eye is darkness, how deep is that darkness? I believe it's in the Sermon on the Mount. But it's this notion of if you're looking at it in a healthy way, if you are receiving it in a healthy way, then there's a lot of light, there's a lot of good, there's a lot of joy and benefit that's happening. But when that perspective gets shifted or darkened, or when that perspective gets closed off, or using the Genesis 3 language again, you get tempted or drawn in to something that you see it and you're like, that's a better way to look at that. That's a more attractive way because it makes me feel better. And again, this whole conversation is about balancing the notion of your perspective, your perception of the world, with someone else's perception and what might be the third objective reality to the whole condition.
Sure.
And I think that, again, what we have to be mindful of is that as long as we are here in this present space, in this present condition, we will operate from skewed perspectives.
Sure.
We will never, the arrogance of both believers and non-believers at times I'm often bothered by this. I'm not going to spend the next few minutes beating up on this mindset, but I'm frequently bothered by people of faith who will attack the arrogance of non-believers and sort of dismiss their questions or their claims out of, sort of a reductive, like, oh, that's just foolish thinking. But I am equally bothered by non-believers who do the same thing and think that believers who come to this table with their perspective of faith and they dismiss them and say like, oh, well, you need to just accept this reality and you need to just accept this perspective. I guess in general, I'm just bothered when somebody will dismissively attack the perspective of another person while not simultaneously acknowledging that we too come from a certain perspective, that we too bring certain things to the table. And again, I don't believe anybody genuinely holds true a belief that they think is false. They may espouse something that they know to be questionable, but they don't genuinely believe something in their heart of hearts that they think might be false. So if we believe something, then we think it's true, but we have to simultaneously acknowledge that we may not have all the information, and there may be an Oculus of sorts through which we're seeing things. You don't think there's a socio-political race issue in this country? Show me your facts, show me your evidence, and I think if you're looking honestly and realistically at that condition, you're going to recognize that you come from a certain perspective and that your conclusions are flavored by your perspective and your experience. Same thing for the other side of the fence, is that I just think we could all do with a healthy dose of listening to one another and this is why community and accountability is so important to me, is because there's safety in a community that is as diverse as possible.
Sure.
Because when there is respect and when there is a mutual affection and there's a mutual sort of dignity applied across the board, but there is a different perspective given, then there's a lot of health there. Iron sharpens iron in those conditions, and then nobody ever really gets too far into the throes of the mirror's power, again, to use Oculus's thing, because there will always be a perspective to draw you back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, you won't, if you're conservative and you surround yourself with conservatives, like, you need to get some diehard liberal friends that you will listen to. If you're liberal and diehard liberal, you need to surround yourself with some conservatives that you can trust and that you can engage in these ideas with, so that you can never go too far, too deep into the perspective of that mirror, because it's a black hole. Same thing for believers and non-believers and any sort of issue or category that you could put on it. Surround yourself with as diverse a group as you possibly can, for your own accountability's sake and for the sake of challenging your own perspective, so that you can at least get closer to knowing what the objective reality might be, and at the very least, you will not get sucked so deeply into your own perspective that you lose your grip on things and start being distorted. Does that all make sense? Or is it a little too? No?
I'm tracking with you, buddy.
All right.
I'm tracking with you. It's funny, like. I really don't want to dive down this path because I think we're at a good place of stopping, but I had this whole other thematic idea that I just love in the movie, this conceit of the past overlapping with the present, and we're less the sum of our current moment, more the confluence of all we've ever done and been and seen. And I don't know, I think there's a lot, there's a lot going on in the movie, and I dug it. Now, if we can, are you good?
I'm good. Yeah. No.
Okay. We did a thing last week. We'll try it here, and who knows, maybe it'll become a thing. I want to hear, and I think, Reed, you may want to too. Listener, if you've enjoyed this conversation, engage with us on the Facebook page, on this post. So Oculus is all about this wackadoo mirror that makes people do wackadoo things. If you were stuck in a strange time loop because of a weird household object turned evil, what would it be? What would your weird house? I'll tell you what mine would be. This just came to me in the moment. I did not prep this. It'd be the stupid refrigerator. That thing messes with my perspective so bad. I'm like, I need food. I don't need food. I need some food. I don't need food. You're not really hungry, but that's food. That's leftovers. It's food. It's good. But you're not even hungry. Close the refrigerator. No. It's good. It's good. Oh my God. I just ate
You need it.
Something off the floor. You know, like my reality's getting all jacked up. Yes. So yeah. Reed, do you have one off the top of your head? It's okay if you don't.
My first go-to was the bookshelf.
Oh, okay.
It was like, Because I
But
will
see,
spend, but then
that's a very positive one.
it can be
'cause you're
enriching
like,
too. Yeah,
alternate perspectives and
I'm
empathy.
I'm a very positive guy, Nathan. I'm really.
I'm a very hungry guy, Reed.
Oh my gosh, I have to tell you a joke.
Please.
So I have to tell you a joke.
Is it a fanny joke?
No, I love that joke. Listeners, I can't remember what episode I told that joke, but I love that joke. So, no, there's...
It was on The Visit. It was on The Visit.
Was it on The Visit?
This is about grandparents.
Man.
Yep.
Yes, go back and listen to The Visit because my grandfather told me my favorite joke ever. And so anyway, but I heard a joke that was actually on Sanford and Son. There's this very heavy-set lady who's standing in the jewelry store.
Said no 38-year-old white man in 2018 ever.
ever. But no, so she's standing in the jewelry store, and when she's standing in the jewelry store, she's trying to debate on something, and Fred Sanford's getting real irritated because he needs to ask a question, and she's taking up all this guy's time, and so she's sitting there, and again, this woman is a bit on the chubby side, and so then you're hungry is what made me think of this. She's like, I don't know if I should buy this or not. Part of me says yes, and part of me says no. And he looks at her and says, well, what part of you's been saying, feed me, feed me, feed me?
Oh,
It's a really disrespectful line, but it makes me crack up every single time. Oh my gosh, I love it. I love it so much. But I have a question for listeners.
What you watching? What you reading, listening?
Oh, there it is.
You like that?
There it is. I do like
What's
that.
your question, Reed? What's your question?
So, no. So seriously, and sincerely, not sinceriously. I just made up words. But what are some ways that you challenge your own perspective on a regular basis? And if you don't, what are some ways that you would like to begin? What are some ways that you have, whether you're a believer, non-believer, conservative, liberal, whatever platform you come from, what are some ways that you actively challenge your perspective on an ongoing basis? And if you haven't got one of those, if you haven't got one of those, then think of one. And yeah.
I mean, I think mine's pretty good question too. But
yours is a great question. No, yours is a great question. We want to know both. Because the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but it is not the end of the conversation. I don't think I said that last week, but I do. We have some David S. Pumpkins to get into. Let's just hammer this out real quick. So on every episode where we talk about a film, we have a very specific metric of David S. Pumpkins. Longtime listeners know it by now. We're going to rate this on style, scares, and substance. Mr. Nathan Rouse, what would you give Oculus for its style?
This may surprise you. I'm going to give it a 4. Like, that's a solid for me. And decent, part of me is giving this, part of me is giving that. Which part of me is saying, feed me? I think a good portion of that 4 is just because I was so unsure in those first 30 minutes that by the end of it, I was like, oh my God, this is scary.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I think it kind of swung it pretty hard. So I'm going to go with a 4 on style.
Yeah, it's a 4 for me as well. I think it's really well executed, well crafted film. Yeah, it's got some deeply intense scares. We didn't even go into half of them. The last half of the movie is nerve-wracking, and about every few minutes there's some new thing either jumping out at you or freaking you out. So yeah, 4 for me for style. And then it's funny because I feel like I just sort of gave the justification for my scares mode, but my scares is going to go from 4 and go up to a 4.5 because I think it's a very freaky film, particularly in that last half.
I'm actually awarding this better than I would have thought before our conversation. I think I may
do it.
I may join you in that 4.5.
Yeah.
I mean, my only hesitation is simply because I think of the movies I've given 5s for scares to, like a 7, or what did we give recently that was all 5s?
A Quiet Place. A Quiet Place was all 5s down the line.
Like, I don't know that this movie does what those movies do, but I mean, yeah, some of the imagery. You know, the fingernail and the Band-Aid, the Apple light bulb. We didn't even mention this, when she accidentally kills her fiance and doesn't think it's real. Like, there's a lot of genuinely scary stuff in this movie. So I think a 4.5 is where I'm going to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what would you say for the substance meter?
I mean, I think it's a 4.5. Like, the concept of an item that begets all manner of conflicting perspectives is pretty ripe for thematic discussion. And I think,
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I'm actually landing right there with you with a 4.5 for substance. I think it is, it's a deeply compelling premise. And as we've already just exhibited, has the potential to make your brain go to a variety of places. So it's a deep film in that context. So yeah, do you want to tell them what that brings it to for our David S. Pumpkins measurement?
It turns out that in episode 2 of #Consider the Blooms, Mike Flanagan's Oculus earns a pretty impressive 8.5 David S. Pumpkins on the Fear of God David S. Pumpkins meter. So yeah, I mean, I'll give credit. I didn't know what to expect of Oculus. I chose it because it had a weirdo premise about a magic mirror, and by the end of it, I'm asking my wife to hold my hand down the hall.
Now I will say, and I have one more announcement before we sort of sign off officially, but I will say, to listeners, we in sort of our conversation, we spoiled the final beats of the film, and we spoiled some general elements of the premise, but we haven't talked about it that much. It's well worth your seeking.
Oh yeah,
it's freaky. It's very, like Nathan has said multiple times, it's a very freaky, scary film, but it's well worth your seeking out. It's available to stream on Netflix as of this recording, and probably as of this airing as well. But before we officially sign off, I feel remiss. I did not announce this near the top, and so I'll say it as we're leaving our listeners with this. Be sure to go over to our Facebook page and our Twitter feed, and put in your votes in our Summer Slam of Monsters, or Tournament of Monsters, or Monster Mash. Yes. So go this week. You are nominating, of the 25 nominees that we give you, you're competing for the top 16 that are gonna compete in our Tournament of Monsters. So we'll give you the results of that next time. So go in there, vote for your top 16. Well, basically what you're doing is you're just going to the Survey Monkey and you're picking your favorite 5, and we're going to take the top 16 of those, and then we're going to release what the official tournament will be starting next week. So yeah, by all means, ladies and gentlemen, go ahead and vote your favorites of those. And Nathan, thank you so much for watching this film and for having this conversation with me, man. As always.
No problem. We'll see you in the Oculus next time, everybody.
Bye-bye, guys. Take care of Dr. Oculus, and we'll see you next time.
The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but it is not the end of the conversation. To continue this conversation, you can follow us on Twitter @TheFearOfGod. Visit us on Facebook to comment on one of our posts, or to post there yourself. You can follow Reed on Twitter @ReedLackey. You can follow Nathan on Twitter @TheNathanRouse. Visit morethanonelesson.com to leave a comment on this post or any of the official episode posts. Email us at fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. And last but not least, if you listen to us through iTunes, we would greatly appreciate a rating or a review. Thank you for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next week.